And at some point, it really dawned on me that actually imperfection is this kind of gift. Because if we lived in a world where some people really could perfect themselves and really be better than everybody else, we would have no argument for equality. We could really say, okay, there's perfect people and there's imperfect people, and this is just the way it is. Our shared imperfection is what sort of says to us, no one is always going to have the right answer. No one is going to be more worthwhile than someone else. No life is more worthwhile than some other life. We're all flawed. We all bring something to the table. So our imperfection was this kind of sign of our equality and also of our necessary humility. And that these were not bad things, but these were things that opened us up to other people, that made it possible for us to form community with other people.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're delighted to give you all a free pass for an hour to escape your onerous obligations, forget the long to-do list, and join us in a bit of lively discussion as an antidote to all the holiday angst. We do have some help at hand in the form of two fine minds. Our guests come from dissimilar academic backgrounds, but have arrived at a common point of discovery intellectually. Both have recently written books about the very real challenge of everyday living as it pertains to people everywhere. How do we learn to be happy with what we have and stop pursuing some impossible and unattainable expectation of existence? This constant striving and overachieving seems to plague Americans more than most. We end up being among the most anxious people on the planet. It's especially noticeable at this time of year when people are struggling to make their houses perfect for the holidays and feeling guilt-tripped into buying presents, largely with money they maybe don't have and that are not needed. So let's stop for a minute and inject some fresh thinking into this subject. Is there a better way to proceed? Perhaps a good time to introduce our two guests. AVRAM ALPERT is a writer and educator. He's written the book, The Good Enough Life. It suggests that an acceptance of our limitations can lead to a more fulfilling life and a more harmonious society. He's currently a research fellow at the New Institute in Hamburg, and he's working now on a book about wisdom. Welcome to you, Avi. Our second guest, Kiran Setia, is a professor of philosophy at MIT, and he has produced a book, Life is Hard. This is a refreshingly realistic antidote to many of the platitudes pushed by the burgeoning self-improvement industry. Setia suggests that trying to live the perfect life in difficult circumstances will only bring us disappointment, since much of the hardships in life can't be changed or ignored. So we need to come to terms with reality. So welcome to you both, gentlemen. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to start with you, Avi, coming to this at this late hour from Germany. Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
This lovely expression of yours, the good enough life, doesn't sit so well with the current culture, which is kind of a mythology here in the United States, which idealizes this perfectly curated life. So tell us a bit about the history of the title and also about how you came to write the book.
Sure. And let me just say thanks again to Mary for organizing it, Frederic and Andrew in the background, and Kieran also for being part of the conversation. And thanks, Mary, for kind of giving me that extra push to finally read Kieran's book, which is really excellent. And I recommend to everyone. And hopefully we'll talk more about our overlaps here. So The Good Enough Life was based on an idea from Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist, worked mostly with the family. And Winnicott saw that parents who tried to be great were making this actually great mistake. When they tried to do too much for their children, when they tried to give their children everything, when they tried to make sure their children wouldn't have pain or suffer or any of these things, they were taking away their child's ability to understand the world that they were entering into. This complex, fraught, often difficult world that required us to be creative, to be adaptive, to marvel at strangeness and difficulty and keep working through it. And so Winnicott didn't then say, well, okay, if you're not going to be great, just give up. Of course not. No, he said, you still have to be good enough. right? You have to be good, you have to be caring, you have to be decent, you have to love your child, and you have to provide enough. You have to make sure they have the material needs to grow and prosper. And I thought when I was working through this phrase and this idea, I'm not a Winnicott, specialist by any extent, but the idea caught in my mind, and I thought, where else does this apply? What else is this doing? And this phrase good enough suggested something really important to me. And it was because it combined in this language a few different ideas. One was goodness and one was enoughness, and they were linked. And it was no longer that you could think, well, I'm a moral person, so I don't need to care about my material life, or I'm a rugged capitalist, so I don't need to care about my spiritual life. It was that actually what we are as human beings is, we have both symbolic or meaning-based needs and we have material needs. And good enough brings these together at the same time that it cuts back on some of the excess pressure, some of the undue and impossible goals that we can start to strive for when we think about the good life, or the materially perfect life, or whatever it might be. And good enough gave us this idea of imperfection, which I think maybe we'll talk a bit about more, but for me is a really kind of key idea for developing some potent parts of the human condition.
I kind of like that underlying concept of imperfection in the book. Since many equate that word with something which is less than or substandard, and you see it as a kind of gift that you can maybe learn from, and you actually worked on that in your last book, the Buddhist approach of what imperfection can teach you about living well. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can explain a little bit about that and your sort of relationship with Buddhism as part of that journey.
Sure. And I think that for like a lot of people, when I first started thinking about imperfection, it was something to kind of bear with, deal with, push through. Okay, life isn't perfect, but it's going to be all right. And we have the resources. And at some point, it really dawned on me that actually imperfection is this kind of gift. Because if we lived in a world where some people really could perfect themselves and really be better than everybody else, we would have no argument for equality. We could really say, okay, there's perfect people and there's imperfect people, and this is just the way it is. Our shared imperfection is what sort of says to us, no one is always going to have the right answer. No one is going to be more worthwhile than someone else. No life is more worthwhile than some other life. We're all flawed. We all bring something to the table. So our imperfection was this kind of sign of our equality and also of our necessary humility. And that these were not bad things, but these were things that opened us up to other people. That made it possible for us to form community with other people. Having the friend who's kind of perfect or tries to be all the time can be quite frustrating, right? But having that friend who's vulnerable like you, who's flawed like you, who opens themselves up like you, this can really create connections between people. And so imperfection is this path to the egalitarian community. And once I started to think about that, I also started to realize that, sometimes we idealize other groups of humans or ways of being in the world. And for me, when I was younger, that really was Buddhism. I had this very kind of stereotypical suburban American, I'm tired of these Western religions. Buddhism has it figured all out. I'm going to go be Zen and everything's going to be fine. And then as I studied and learned more about Buddhist history, I realized that, of course, Buddhists are people, like all people. They're not perfect. They make lots of mistakes. Buddhist philosophy is flawed and complex and internally fraught in various ways. And for a while, what I did was to kind of say, well, I don't need to think about Buddhism then, right? It's not perfect. I need to go find this other thing. And I started to think, actually, no, it still offers these amazing insights, these amazing ideas, even the kind of modernized Buddhism that I received, the kind of Alan Watts Buddhism, it's still quite interesting. Once I stopped believing that it was perfect, once I stopped reading that it had all the insights. So imperfection was also a way for me to appreciate things that I think I would have glossed over otherwise.
So just before I go to the quote about greatness, which is this huge issue, how to be great and what greatness is, you yourself, were you kind of struggling with that kind of dilemma of being successful, being happy, doing good? I mean, was that something to do with your own journey that actually caused you to pursue this in a book?
Yeah, no, and I still am. I mean, I don't have exactly the solution for this, which is why I think, okay, I just have to be good enough. I don't have to offer the perfect solution. It's okay. And I think this came out in one of the kind of pre-discussion questions. I want to be good enough, but how do I do it? And there are ways, and we can talk more about that. But it's certainly true that when you live in a society, in a culture where you don't know, I mean, I really don't know year to year, will I have a job? Am I going to be okay? Will I, how am I going to proceed in this life? And I see that the people who manage to do that are ones who are somewhat lucky, but also the ones who achieve some kind of realm of greatness, right? They're the most famous at this place, or they published this book that got the most reviews or the most responses. And then I think, well, if I can't do that, how am I supposed to get a job? How am I supposed to keep kind of doing the work that I love doing, being part of the community that I love being a part of? And, I don't always know. I just kind of muddle along. I try when I can. If I'm convening a panel, it's sometimes really nice to bring in a grad student or an adjunct professor or someone who hasn't had the opportunity, so there's these kind of small things you can do, recognizing that work, talking about it as much as you can. But it's really, it's not easy. So I totally felt that. I mean, I think in the book I start, I wanted to be of course, I was 5, I watched sports, I wanted to be a famous athlete, I wanted to be a stockbroker. I mean, I had all these silly fantasies that, I was very fortunate that I grew up in a family, in a context that helped me kind of wean myself off of these, see how destructive they could be when we were kind of fighting each other all the time, living in this winner versus loser culture. And that wasn't what I wanted to be a part of. And I wanted to dedicate myself to something else. And I'm very happy that I did, even with the, occasional precariousness that comes with that.
Now you're going to say you're married to some amazing financier that enables this to happen.
I'm married to an amazing person. She's an artist. I mean,
so you're both living rather precariously then.
But it's still beautiful. I mean, I would never do it any differently.
Good. So, in your book, you say that, we have become this nation obsessed with greatness. And the quote was in the book, "This vision of the world has given us an epidemic of stress, anxiety, inequality, and ecological damage." So that's huge. It's not just about our own sort of, I'm doing it this way. It's the entire ramification of that on the planet. So how did this impetus infect the American psyche? Is there a way we can kind of rewind the clock where we certainly worsened it with, as you say, this concept of winners and losers, which has been reinforced in the media? You're either, well, we won't even mention who made a big deal of that. But so how did we kind of evolve to this state of being? Is there anything you can see as an attributable watershed moment that changed us or made us more obsessed with this kind of idea, this myth of being great?
I mean, I don't have probably I'm not an American historian, cultural studies person, but I've kind of absorbed this culture, living up in it. And, one of the things that I found actually looking through the intellectual history, United States is this very capitalist nation. And there is something, philosophically speaking, in the roots of capitalism that doesn't necessarily go this way, but can under certain circumstances. And I try to say this somewhat briefly, but Adam Smith, as people may know, is a moral philosopher, was the kind of father of capitalism, wrote The Wealth of Nations, but also wrote this book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And one of Smith's, that people like me tend to like a bit more because it's a bit more critical, but Smith's point in that book is actually, it's not good to pursue self-interest. It's not the right thing to do. We should be benevolent. We should care about each other in the theory of moral sentiments. But he has a problem. And he basically says, what we really want in life is to love, to be loved, to be part of a community. Who do we see who is loved? Well, we see the great and the powerful loved. And sometimes we see that the wise and the good are not, right? They're kind of tossed aside. They're discarded. They're not respected as much. They don't get the same acclaim in society. And so people want to be great. And Smith thinks, and I think this is the kind of error, he thinks there's nothing we can do about this. All that we can do is find a way to have greatness work out for the rest of us. And so he sort of says, well, pursue your self-interest. You won't be able to spend all that you earn. And so eventually you're going to have to spread it back around in the community. And so Smith's theory is this invisible hand will kind of make the world more, give it enough equality, sufficient equality. And then what happens, I think, is that, in the US culture, we democratize the wrong part of greatness, right? We don't democratize this idea that everybody is good, unique, virtuous, has this capacity, right? We democratize this idea that someone can be that great person who has too much that they then have to give it away. And once you do that, right, once you sort of say, we live in a democracy where it's not about sharing power, it's about having access to the possibility of dominating others. You don't really have a democracy, but you also have a winner-loser culture. And then if you're not on the kind of winner side of that, then you wind up feeling kind of on the loser side of it. And again, I think this may be something we can come back to in Kieran's book, but this is part of the problem of telling your life as a kind of narrative, right? You sort of say, well, I'm a winner. I'm trying to telling my story, but I'm going to be the one on top, or I'm a loser. I didn't make it. We miss out, right? Even in this terrible system that really pits us against each other, you miss out on the plurality, the complexity, and all the other things going on in your life. So I think that this is a tremendous pressure. It really is on us, but there are things we can do in our own lives and how we interact with others to push back.
Okay, so let's touch a little bit on the sort of spiritual dimension before I move over to Kieran. The mall has in some ways kind of replaced the cathedral now in terms of significance in people's lives. You know, it's the place they all flock to on Sundays. And it seems to be that you're acknowledging, both of you actually, a kind of spiritual void, suggesting that we need a moral imperative to lead a good life. And the quote that I liked was, good enoughness reminds us not to be too hard on ourselves. None of us is perfect. None of us can be perfectly good enough in a world largely driven by greatness and the competitive demands of the modern economy. At the same time, good enoughness refuses to let us capitulate on these imperfections. Adopting the good enough world view means doing a little better each day to orient ourselves towards making a world good, decent, and sufficient for all. This is what I mean about the common good that you allude to. So with that thought, I'm moving over now to Kieran. You're a philosopher operating at MIT, this techno world, which must be a challenge when you're sort of surrounded by a tribe of problem solvers. Yet in your book, you draw both on knowledge of ancient advice and understanding from the philosophers, and then you combine that with personal hardships to kind of give a wake-up call to your readers. So can you tell us a little bit about how you combined your academic expertise and your own kind of hard life knocks, or certainly chronic pain and other problems, and how you came to write about that?
So the book really did come out of my experience with chronic pain. I have chronic pelvic pain, which I've had since I was 27. And it's one of those things that, you know, I now have a diagnosis, which took quite a while, but the diagnosis is chronic pelvic pain, which is basically just a name for the symptoms. I mean, it's not exactly illuminating. It's one of these things there's no reliable treatment for. And it does, you know, it changes your sense of what the question about how to live well looks like when you think, well, whatever it's going to look like, it's not going to look like it's free of physical suffering. It's going to involve that for an indefinite period of time. But there's also, I found philosophical puzzlement in why exactly this experience was so difficult and so challenging, because, you know, my chronic pain is not debilitating. I'm able to do this, for instance. I'm able to keep my job, and that, you know, sleep deprivation is the hardest thing, but I can live with it. And I found philosophical thinking about pain, phenomenologists who study the character of lived experience, really illuminating and consoling. I mean, even just understanding in a deeper way what's bad about it, I found helpful, but also orienting. And there's also the consolation of solidarity, of sort of sharing and communicating an experience like that. But I didn't want to write a book that was entirely about me or entirely about the experience of chronic pain. And I suppose if there was a kind of moment, if you were going to make the Hollywood movie of how I came to write the book, the anecdote I would tell is that there was, at some point, I was recognizing that this condition was not going to go away. And I felt very angry and very bitter. And I remember sitting somewhere, watching people, strangers, walk by across a room, thinking with terrible envy, you don't know how good you have it, you know, not being in pain. And then there was a beat, and I thought, I have absolutely no idea what these people are going through. It could be any kind of hardship. It could be much worse than what I'm going through. And at that point, I sort of had this sense that it's not inevitable that one's own suffering can be a path to thinking about suffering more generally, or to compassion for others, but it can be. There are moments you can seize on at which you can treat your own, whatever difficulties you're going through, as symptomatic of the fact that everyone is going through difficulties, and that that's part of the human condition that philosophy really needs to address. Then, of course, I was working on this before the pandemic, then the pandemic hit. And so at that point, there was an epidemic of loneliness, of grief, and the kind of theme of the book that life is hard, and the best we can hope for, and what we should hope for, is to live well in the face of that by grappling with it, came to feel a kind of much more universal than it had felt even beforehand. And so I kind of wrote the book during the first year of the pandemic, kind of locked down with my word processor and books I was reading, and it really shaped how I wrote it.
I just have to ask you a question, which just came to me while you were talking.
Sure.
Was the experience of being in pain exacerbated by being alone in the pandemic, or is it lessened, or psychologically feels lessened by being out and about?
I mean, for me, one of the big difficulties of pain, I think this is true for a lot of people, is the way it draws attention to your body, and sort of it's not just that pain is bad in itself, it obstructs your engagement with other people and the world. And so the way I mostly cope with it is by throwing myself into doing other things, like really trying to pay attention to other things, other people. And so some of that was taken away during the pandemic. But honestly, I think writing a book is one of the, for me, working on something like that, really being engrossed in something, is one of the ways I can sort of make my body just sort of subside into the background. And so I found working on the book really therapeutic.
Interesting. So I think a lot of the world seems to operate in a tremendously precarious position. Lots of people are concerned just about where the next meal is coming from. Are their children safe? Can they get access to a doctor? I mean, very basic things. Why is it that we, generally in the West, want or expect a more cushy landing in life? Where did that thinking come from? It's kind of remarkable.
I think it has really deep roots. I mean, I should say that even in the West, in the US and the UK, I think poverty rates are still, hovering around 10%. And with right now, I think a lot of people are facing inflation and cost of living crises. I think especially in the UK right now, things are very difficult. But then even the affluent face hardships. I mean, there's no way to get through life without facing infirmity, aging, loneliness, grief, failure, the injustice and absurdity of the world. And in a way, I think it's not a mystery why we would want to avoid hardship, but why deny it? Why pretend that the ideal of living your best life, finding your bliss, is always within reach? And that's what I think has really deep roots, both in philosophy and in human psychology. It goes back to, in philosophy, to Aristotle. So he writes the Nicomachean Ethics, his central book in ethics, and it ends by saying, yeah, there's the life of practical virtue dealing with the difficulties of getting along with others. But really, it ends with a vision of the ideal life of contemplation, a life free of human need and human attachment even. So that vision, the idea that we should approach living with a vision of the ideal life and aim towards that, goes right back to the roots of Western philosophy. And it also has deep roots in human psychology. There's a quote from the philosopher Simone Weil: "Thought flies from affliction as promptly and irresistibly as an animal flies from death." And I think that's right. There's a way in which, of course, we flee from thinking about the ways in which life is hard, because it's painful to think about the ways in which life is hard. I mean, I just said one of the ways I cope with pain is by engrossing myself in something else. So I think those are very deep reasons why we might turn away from the difficulties in life. The problem is that if we don't go through the pain of facing up to the ways in which life is painful, we're not going to be able to come to terms with reality and actually live the kind of good life that engages with what's actually happening around us, and happening both to us and to everyone else in the world. So I think we have to get through that difficulty despite the philosophical and psychological obstacles to it.
Well, there's a lot of books on the market, as you know, trying to help us find ourselves, find meaning, find direction, be the best, the most popular, the fittest. I mean, ever number of those books, and they sell. So there's this kind of deep dissatisfaction lurking under the surface in people's lives. And I'm not sure why that is, whether we're scratching an itch, which is normal, and we've just made it fester. But I think that one thing that's kind of strange is that we have this idea of a good life being attached to being happy. And that's not necessarily true, is it? I mean, they're two different kind of concepts.
Right.
You
I
make
think that
happiness as a kind of byproduct, but I'll let you talk about
yeah,
that.
no. I think that's a deep kind of philosophical distinction that is very orienting to make. Now, philosophers often make this distinction between being or feeling happy on the one hand and living well on the other with kooky thought experiments. So the classic thought experiment is you imagine yourself the sole person plugged into a simulation that perfectly simulates ordinary life, maybe a wonderful life, and you don't know you're plugged in, and you're the only person plugged in, and you feel happy. As far as you can tell, things are great, but you're not actually engaging with anyone or anything but this simulation machine. You're not really living a good life. You're barely living a life at all. And, you wouldn't want someone you love to plug into that and just be, in a vat or of fluids, alone forever. And what that tells us is, right, there's feeling happy, it's just a state of mind. And then there's actually living well, which involves engaging with the world around you. And you can't really live well unless you're living in the truth. You have to live in the world as it is, not the world as you wish it would be. And so I think that reorientation is crucial to overcoming some of the distortions that dominate the self-help genre. I mean, it's also useful in helping us to realize that if we're going to live well, that's not just a matter of treating ourselves the way we should. It's a matter of treating other people as we should. It has this ethical dimension that Avi also drew attention to. And in a way, even though, philosophers often start with these wild thought experiments, these are the contrast between feeling happy and living well shows up in all kinds of ordinary contexts. So grief is one of the paradigm examples, that grief is painful. It's not a way of feeling happy, but it's an essential part of living well to acknowledge loss. The same thing is true of when we read the paper and we're angry about the injustice of the world. We're onto something. That's a kind of pain about the way the world is that we wouldn't be living better if we got rid of that pain. That pain is giving us a guide to reality and how to orient ourselves towards it. So yes, I think if we try to live well, and we're lucky enough, one of the side effects will be happy. But yeah, I don't think aiming at happiness is really aiming at the right thing.
So it's interesting. Somebody's just typed a question in, and this kind of zones into the heart of the matter. This idea that we talked about before of the good enough being slightly less than or substandard. Somebody said, please describe or compare the difference between good enough and settling.
I think that's a key distinction. I think that in a way, it's the contrast between saying, I'm going to make the best of what might be a bad lot. I'm not going to accept, just because I'm going to accept that things are bad or difficult in the sense of acknowledging that, not trying to deny it, not in the sense of not trying to change it or just, giving into it. But I'm going to take in that reality and then try to do something good with it. That, I think, is sort of a healthy way to think about not settling, but it's very different from evaluating how you're doing by the standard of what the ideal life or the best life would be. That's what I think is that's the source of the crippling self-doubt and anxiety and often shame and blame that I think both Avi and I, in focusing on ideas about being good enough, the good enough life, really want to turn away from. I don't know, maybe Avi also has thoughts about that question. I don't know.
Yeah, jump in if you want to comment on that.
Sure. No, thanks to the anonymous question too. It's interesting. There's a book. I want to say that it's a political scientist, and I think it's Robert Goodin, has a book called On Settling, which makes an interesting argument, kind of to defend settling and to say settling isn't just giving up effectively. It can also be, right, we're settled, we're calm, we're present, we're kind of dealing with what's here, and that act of settling then kind of allows us to move forward. So there's a way. I mean, it depends a little bit what we mean by settling. But other than that, you know, I the way we tend to use settling or good enough colloquially, right? Good enough as well can sound, and people have said this to me. It's not, and I think it's not an unfair criticism, right? It's not inspiring. Right? You say you just want to be good enough. Like, it sounds kind of okay. Right? You want me to get out of, you know, I don't have to do anything then. It's good enough. It's fine. But I think when we really think through what would constitute good enough, right? What would actually make a world that is decent, that is caring, that provides meaning, that provides opportunity, that provides also material and emotional sufficiency for people. It's not that low a bar. It's actually an incredibly high bar. And it's an achievable one if this is what we want to do, is really to kind of make it possible for everybody. But if our argument is, well, you know, I don't want to just settle, I want to get the max, then I think what we lose is that actually this goal of you trying to maximize means that someone else is almost necessarily minimizing. This is the sort of consequence. And if we think about this more in terms of what, Mary, you've been pointing us to, right, the common good, then what is good enough is part of this, what's shared and what's meaningful among us. So this would be one way to think about good enough, not just as like, you know, I built this bed and there's some screws left over. I think, okay, it's good enough. It's not going to fall down. But actually, like, no, everyone has a bed. Okay, that's good. Like, that's what we're going for.
Sufficient. Okay. You're just making me think about something I read earlier in the year in the New York Times. There was this great piece about Jeff Bezos wanting to take his $5 million luxury yacht into Rotterdam. And in order to do it, it's such a colossal thing. They wanted to take down a bridge to enable this yacht to get through into Rotterdam Harbour. And there was a massive clash between the locals and Jeff Bezos. And the Dutch, who have a preference for modesty over extravagance, the community over the individual, and for fitting in rather than standing out, didn't take kindly to this at all. And I loved this chap that was interviewed. The councillor vigorously opposed the dismantling of this bridge. And actually they won. Jeff Bezos had to go elsewhere. He said, here in Holland, we don't believe that everyone can be rich the way people do in America, where the sky's the limit. We think, be average. That's good enough. And I wondered what you, Avi, now living in Germany, have noticed perhaps in cultural differences in the short time you've been there in regard to this, and whether you miss people here telling you to have a great day, which when I first got here just used to really freak me out because it seemed like such a colossal expectation to have a great day. But anyway, I'll let you answer the question.
Thank you. No, and you'd say like have a beautiful day would be your sort of standard, a beautiful evening, which is nice. Whether Germans then have a greater kind of sense of beauty than America, I probably wouldn't make this argument, but it's nice that it's there in the language. And I remember we talked about this at some point, and I think it's complicated. There's certainly true that Northern European countries especially have developed historically this kind of welfare state model in which you set kind of floors and ceilings, or at least this was the goal. It's complicated because, you know, that is cracking here as anywhere. You know, I was just reading in it was either the Financial Times, the New York Times, that a lot of Norwegian rich people are now leaving for Switzerland because they don't want to pay their taxes anymore. And, you know, so we see this kind of development everywhere. I think this is something of a global problem, but it is also true. And I think I do want to hold on to this sort of social democratic ideal. It is amazing that it was instituted. It was unfortunately instituted in a small geographic space that often protected it by denying it to other places in the world. There's some remarkable, I talk about in the book, there's some remarkable footage of unionized Swedish laborers in, I want to say Libya, but I'm not sure that's right now, but calling in the military to stop a local mine workers from unionizing, right? That this was kind of we protect our wealth so that we can have it at the expense of other people. And this was a terrible model. And we see this is the refugee crisis. These are migrant crises. These push the rise of far right movements. And so I don't know. I have some not Euroscepticism as in the EU sense, but some skepticism to the sort of European self-identity. But I do want to say that stories like that are hopeful. And it's amazing that people say that and they put that out there. And that kind of normative force, even if it's not always true, right, does carry some weight and can kind of push us back from the brink.
Well, I think it just makes you kind of take stock for a minute that, that greatness isn't always associated with the amount of money in your Swiss bank account. And it wasn't impressing this chap. And he was saying, this is really not really a big deal to us. Other things are in Holland. And that's what I thought was quite nice, that you can't buy your way into everything. Certain things are sacrosanct, and the bridge was one of them. I just thought it was kind of a nice point. Anyway, I wanted to talk about this idea about living in the age of desire and anxiety. I think that we all must be aware of how much pressure people, particularly the young people that are under 30, are under right now, with this kind of huge expectation to be all sorts of things. There's focus on their image, on their appearance, on achievement. You curate your friends, your Facebook, it's almost as though you've got to create this persona online, which in some ways is not even related to who you are. It's just got to exist. And it's very difficult to know how to operate in that universe, because anything that you bring that's human to that is somehow less than acceptable, because you're flawed. We're all flawed. So I just wondered how you felt that young people were particularly being affected by this kind of onerous weight of having to be perfect and super achieving and have a TikTok video and any number of things. So you can both answer this, but you can start if you want, Avi. Jump in, anybody?
Do you want to?
Well, I was going to say, I do think there's something really disturbing about the way in which forms of interaction that are normally don't lend themselves to thought in terms of greatness, namely friendship, kind of your social interactions, where you're not trying to achieve something normally. Now you can try to achieve something, which is getting the more likes on your post than you got on the last post. And so you get a kind of commodification that's not directly about money, although it can be, because if you get enough YouTube followers, you can make money out of it and so on. But it's not directly about that, but it sort of echoes the form of commodification and makes something that wasn't about achieving the most, and by its nature really shouldn't be about achieving the most, namely human connection, into something about human connection. I mean, the other thought about, I would say, about the condition of young people goes back to the ways in which negative emotions, I think, can be appropriate, which is I think young people are right to be angry that they're growing up in a world in which their prospects are worse than they had a right to expect, in a world in which home ownership is extremely difficult. Climate change is already here. It's going to get worse. The jobs are increasingly polarized. There's, terrible jobs and precarious jobs. And then for a lucky few, there are great jobs. But this is not a circumstance they should have to face. And I think in a way, the advice I would give, although I'm conscious that it's easier to give this advice than to follow it, is not to just capitulate to the structural status quo in which, okay, that's the circumstance, I guess I will just have to outcompete the rest of my generation. That's the world I face. But to resist the status quo in which having to outcompete people is increasingly part of what, the first 30 years of your life are structured by, that the increased need to sort of excel at school and on your CV and get into a competitive college. This is part of, going along with that is part of a capitulation to a social structure that doesn't have to be the way it is. And recognizing that it doesn't have to be that way is, I think, really crucial. And this is something that I think Avram's book is incredibly great at doing, is connecting the political conditions in which we're forced to compete with each other for the kind of few prizes that are left, with the personal challenges of feeling inadequate and not good enough, and that those connections are there. So I do think that Avi's way of thinking about this and mine really connect here. I was going to say, I was tempted to say great minds think alike, except I feel like I should say good enough minds think alike. That should be our slogan. But yeah, I'm curious to know what he would say about this, but because I think we're going to be on the same wavelength.
No, for sure. And I've been asked sometimes kind of, what do you think is wrong with this next generation? And I think, no, like they get it. Like they really see the world that Kieran's got. You can either kind of have one of these lucky, cushy things in life, or you can fall to the bottom. And so, of course, they're going through the grind and they're going through this whole process. And I mean, just to share, when I was teaching at Princeton, I came across this survey that had been done of British public school boys in the 1950s or so. And they're asked, would you like a life that is meaningful, but you don't make too much money, or you make a lot of money, but you don't live a very meaningful life? And they say, 80% yes, and 20%, I want the meaningful life. I don't care about the money. 20%, I want money. I did this, unscientifically with 24 Princeton students, and it was entirely reversed. I mean, even worse, right? I got 2 students who said they wanted a meaningful life, where they didn't care about how much money they made, and all the rest said, no, money is what matters. And I asked them, why? And they said, I thought it was quite revealing. If I had that much money, how could my life not be meaningful? Right? I could just, I'd be a millionaire. Of course I'd have meaning. I just could do whatever I want all the time. And there was also, there was some conceptual confusion, right? There was some sense in which, I mean, from my point of view, they were misunderstanding what that life of wealth would be like in terms of their well-being, right? Not in terms of understanding the politics of it, not in terms of understanding the winner-loser culture or the economy they lived in, but in terms of understanding whether this would actually be meaningful for them. And so I think it also goes back a bit, Mary, to your question about providing some spiritual meaning or just meaning in general. I mean, whatever word we want to use, symbolic meaning or just some sort of sense of a good life. And I think this is something that, Kieran is doing this wonderfully. I hope also, in his classes, but it's not something that we do all the time in the humanities, which sometimes shocks me. We don't always take these students who are yearning for meaning, a place in the world, a way to be better, and say, come to our classes, we'll teach you how to be a better friend, a better lover, lead a more meaningful life. We say, okay, open up your textbook and we'll teach you about the 19th century novel or whatever it might be. Or I even said this at a conference the other day and was told, anytime that anyone has a conception of the good life, this is a form of tyranny. And you want to tyrannize your students and tell them how to live. And I said, no, I would like to debate with them and talk with them about this. And I think this is actually something that they want. And so I think one thing that we can offer to kind of push back against the culture that you're describing, Mary, is this, right? That we can actually talk meaningfully. I can't change the economy tomorrow, but we can have a serious discussion about what you want from life and how we can kind of help you find that.
That's actually fascinating to me, because to make that leap, that because you've got lots of money, that would automatically translate to meaning. I find that an incredible leap, because I'm looking at the people that are in that echelon right now, the Kanye Wests and the other successful icons, and I don't know that they're leading a meaningful life in any regard. I mean, I think a really fascinating thing would have been who they really aspire to be and why. That's I think new. I think in the last 20 years, this kind of merge between pop culture, leadership, politics, influencing, being an influencer, wherever that is, that's a big deal. You can have an opinion on something, even if you know nothing about it. But because you've got millions of followers, that has an impact, which is kind of scary. I mean,
yeah, in terms of the idea, I'm tempted to anecdotally say that at MIT, that I think for a while, the ideal was Mark Zuckerberg. Then Cambridge Analytica happened, and the students are like, okay, turns out that Facebook may have destroyed democracy. Let's not go that way. Then Elon Musk was the next candidate on this list. And right now, I'm not sure that his reputation is quite surviving either. So there's a kind of pattern of investing in certain kinds of figures. It's certainly at MIT where a lot of the students want to be tech entrepreneurs. And then the figures that they invested in turn out to be morally, socially, or in other ways problematic. And I think, yeah, talking about that is important, because a lot of the time, it's not that they're being told that's what you should aim for. It's that their education is about excelling at a certain kind of technocratic, in a certain technocratic scheme. And unreflectively, you just start thinking, well, I guess a good life is just doing this really well. Mm. And if you don't have to tell them that that's what a good life is like, it just sort of, it's osmosis. And I think consciously pushing back against that is a very important part of education.
We've got some questions coming in here. Is aiming for a good enough life accepting things and dropping advocating, being engaged to address the issues we face? One shouldn't settle for incompetence nor poor quality, says Deborah. Not quite sure what that question is alluding to.
I mean, I suspect this goes back to I'll say something about this. It goes back to the objection that Avi mentioned earlier, that if you start talking about the good enough life, the suggestion is, well, it's about settling and accepting mediocrity.
Substandard.
And I think that's where it's coming from. And I think I basically just agree with what he said, that actually there's a key difference between settling in the sense of not trying to change things at all, and accepting reality and thinking these are the terms that realistic change would have to start from here. You can't just fantasize about what it would mean to make the world a better place. You have to grapple with all of the imperfections of the world around you. And that actually doing that with this sort of broader view of what it would be to create the possibility of a good enough life in general, it is a demanding ethical project. At the same time, I think there's some real truth in the fact that we should be somewhat self-forgiving. I think actually trying to live a good life under conditions of systemic injustice is very difficult. It's hard. You're complicit in so many things that you can't just opt out of. You can't say, well, could I, climate change is the problem. Could I even opt out of the fossil fuel economy? No, you cannot live a life that is not implicated in some of the things that you might most want to resist. And you can fight it, but I think it is also at the same time important not to be self-punitive about the ways in which no one of us as an individual can transform everything. And there is just the challenge of finding a line between saying, well, there's nothing I can do on the one hand, and saying, I must be a moral hero and a martyr on the other hand, which most of us cannot be. And I think that question of judgment, what's enough, is just the condition we're in. We have to make that judgment call.
It's a really good point.
I would just I agree with all of that. And I would just add, one of the things I was reading Life is Hard today, and one of the things I think Kieran nicely talks about is just telling us little stories, right? So getting involved with a local MIT effort to push back on climate change. Because this is, if we have this all or nothing model, okay, either I'm going to be the great savior, I'm going to be the Greta Thunberg character, or why even bother? Then we don't bother, right? But if it's like, well, I don't know, I'm going to contribute my part and I'm going to do what I can, and you can call that settling, but I think actually you're it's in that positive sense. You're settling into what you're able to do in that moment, and rising to the challenge of what that moment calls for. You're not having kind of utopic fantasies of a silver bullet changing all this, or you being the agent there. But just saying, no, I am also imperfect and I'm doing my best. And if I find other people doing their best and we get together, we can't change this tomorrow, but we can make some real progress. And I have found in my own, I say this, I'm not really giving advice. I'm just always reminding myself of this, because I start to feel very often, well, like, what's the point? I can't change anything. The gas that's pumping behind me is like, straight from hell. What can I do? But I think, well, look, I can turn it down a little bit. I can talk to other people who are doing things in a more structural sense, trying to change the laws. And that's what I'm capable of doing. And that's therefore what I should do, not just kind of lament, it's too big.
Good point. That's a very good point. So translate into action on some level, even if it's local.
Yeah, that's right. I think that collective action at every scale is part of the what has to happen. And I think, yeah, if you think a collective action means politics, then you can vote, but you often feel like politically many of us feel fairly powerless. But then we're always part of little local at a school or a workplace where there's a much smaller collective in which you can make a bigger difference. And often that's in fact satisfying when you're actually doing something as part of a group. It becomes less demoralizing and you feel inspired. And so I think it's a win-win strategy.
And the side byproduct is you're happier.
Right, exactly. I think this is really true. It's that doing something even on a small scale you feel less impotent, you feel less powerless because you are in fact doing something. It's just you're getting rid of the fantasy that the only way to have power would be to be all powerful.
And little things make a big difference. I think that sounds like it really does. Even if it's in your neighborhood or you can start a little action. I think you did at MIT, right? You worked with.
Well, I think this is paradigmatic for me. I'm not really much of a leader. What happened was that there was a student group, Fossil Free MIT. So someone was already leading it, and I just got to join and say, well, what help can I give you as a faculty member? And I think lots of us are like that. We're not going to be, heroic activists. But if there's a group that already exists, look out for one and say, can I join? What can I do? And have someone else kind of give you the leadership that you might not be able to provide yourself. And so, yeah, that's how it was for me, for sure.
Great. Well, both of you suggest that we need some kind of necessary stoicism to be able to lead a good life. And also determination seems to be a prerequisite. The Atlantic wrote a piece about your book, Avi, saying you don't have to be great to have a good life. You don't have to be a moral genius to live well. All you have to do is be interested, keep your eyes open, and not quit. So that's a bit of hopeful advice for everybody. I think we can all achieve that. And you, Kieran, encourage us to be realistic above all, which I love. I love the reality check. We should not aim for happiness or the ideal life, but to try and find sufficient meaning in the world as it is, to celebrate being alive, to cope with grace when life is hard. To live well is to treat not just ourselves, but other people as we should. And the first step in self-help is one that points beyond the self. A lot of great wisdom here today, chats in your books. Somebody's written in here, Bruno Bettelheim wrote, good enough parent. No, it wasn't Bruno Bettelheim, was it?
There might have been, I actually don't know.
Well, your guy was...
Winnicott has the model that I know of, but, I didn't go deep. This wasn't like a literature review kind of book where I tried to piece through. So, I know the name Bettelheim from, I think, my parents' bookshelf, but I don't, I apologize to the question. Oh, no. I don't know.
It's, there's certainly a lot of books about happiness and on how to live the right life. There is a podcast on the Stoics, which I know people that are listening to with great regularity. So clearly it's answering a need, I think. So here we are. We've only got about 5 minutes left. Any words of advice that you think, apart from, maintaining your perspective, engaging with people of like mind on things to affect change in a good way? Any other, particularly at this time of year when everybody's getting all stressed out and expectations are through the roof? There were a couple of articles I know this week and last in The Guardian, which I've posted in the about people that actually have checked out of the whole Christmas thing. And then other people that said that they were going to do it in their conscious way. They were doing it in their conscious way. So we've put the links in there for you. So if you got any suggestions about how you maintain your calm and serenity at this period?
Well,
I
would say here's a piece of general purpose advice that for me was also kind of structuring the way I thought about living well in the book and what philosophy could contribute, but which really it comes down to another anecdote, which is an experience that I have had and that many people have probably had, where you talk to a friend about something you're struggling with, and this will happen this Christmas. People will tell you, here's my problem. And it's very tempting to go immediately into assurance advice mode. It's all going to be fine. Here's what to do. And often that's a form of disavowal or denial. And it's not what people need. The first thing to do is to listen and just acknowledge that does sound very difficult. And often that process of listening is consolation in itself, but also the willingness to sit with the problem, sit with someone when they're going through something difficult or they're struggling over the holidays. That patience to listen is the orienting thing that will solve the problem. Will sort of solve itself in the course of just sitting with it. And so I suppose that's a piece of advice that for me has changed how I approach difficulties in my own life, and when friends are going through difficult times, how I approach them. And despite the fact that this is a time of celebration, it is also for a lot of people kind of challenging in the ways that you're pointing to.
Yeah. That's such wonderful advice that I often give myself, because I am like a fixer by nature. Like if someone comes to me with a problem, no way, okay, so we can try this. And as you said, nobody wants that, right? People want to be, heard. Sometimes people say, hey, actually, I need a solution. Can you tell me that? And then, okay, here's what I have. But usually it's, let's talk this through, or please listen, or just understand what I'm going through. And so if you, just to kind of make a meta moment on Kieran's advice, if you, like me, are a fixer and you find yourself going into fixing mode, forgive yourself for that. Step back, go into the listening, understanding mode, and you can start over. And I think this is really, again, the beautiful thing about understanding ourselves in our world as good enough, is that it's okay to make mistakes. And this is what, again, brings us together. Like that, I can imagine a friend in which I make this kind of fixed mistake, and then I correct myself, as bringing us closer. Right, because they kind of see me making myself vulnerable, see me going through this process of mistakes, understanding that we're kind of struggling through this life together. And I think this is a really wonderful thing. I'm about to go on a very long trip to spend a lot of kind of cloistered time with a family with many different kinds of personalities and desires and interests. And sometimes I think, oh, I wish we were just staying here. I wish but again, this is part of what makes life kind of beautiful and wonderful and strange, is just having all these kinds of experiences and interactions. And I try to remind myself, and I hope people out there will too as well, that whatever, as long as it's not abuse, as long as it's, not anything that we really need to stop, these annoying interactions, the kind of minor difficulties and things, are, again, things that tell us more about what it's like to be a human being, to experience all the eccentricity and the wonder, and sometimes the frustration. And so if you can kind of get yourself into that mindset of appreciation for just kind of what is, I think it helps cut the edge off a little bit.
That's very nice. I also think comparing yourself to some Hollywood version of Christmas is very unhelpful, and very, it just can lead to terrible frustration. I'm not having that kind of, it's Hollywood, they're acting. So I think that's also a reality check. What you're doing for whatever your celebration is what you're doing, and it's fine. That's what I mean about good enough.
Yeah, I think the advice to accept imperfection for most of us, unless your family is very different from mine, that is very good advice for being around family and dealing with Christmas. It's not going to be perfect, but good enough. Yeah.
Right. Last point here before we have to start closing down. Somebody says there's a conversation to be had here about how an anti-racist worldview maps onto greatness versus good enoughness. I wonder if this has come up in your book talks. I don't know if that's to me or to you guys, but.
Yeah, I talk a little bit about this in the book. It depends a little bit where the question is coming from. So I would want to know a little bit more, but I think one of the things that it calls up for me is this idea that, if a world that is really pernicious and degrading for a number of identities, we need to respond. We can't respond with good, right? We need to respond with greatness. We need these great leaders who kind of pull us out and take us out of it. And, you know, I think I struggle with this in the book because it's a very difficult question. But when I started to dig in, the best I can say is that when I started to dig into the history of the civil rights movement, the Black liberation movement, the leaders peeled away. When you really kind of start to read these histories, it is exactly what Kieran was talking about earlier. It's small local communities getting together, forming these networks that really have the power. And then when a leader is certainly helpful and can kind of galvanize that, but then, you know, people like Ella Baker, Barbara, Septima Clark, you know, started to worry. Well, okay, so the leader rises out and galvanizes us, but what happens then if the leader is gone, or the media just fixate on the leader and not on all of us? And what about the power that we're working for, building together? And so if this is, I'm not sure, but if this is where the question is coming from, I think it is a complicated dynamic. But I think at the end of the day, you know, these kinds of organizations are not about having a great person leaving us. They really are about all of us kind of working together and defeating these problems. So I still kind of, I do try to discuss this in the book, and I kind of, okay, yes, good enough still works here. But I find it always an interesting and challenging point.
Well, I hate to tell you, but our hour is up. I think you raised an incredibly wonderful array of different questions for us all to think about. And I would strongly advise, if you can't get these books, go and get your libraries to order them so that you and lots of other people can read them and enjoy them. And you'll feel better. You'll feel better. A lot of good advice. So I'd like to thank AVRAM ALPERT for staying up so late in Germany and for sharing his insights, and for Kieran in Boston, and also for all your hard work that you put into writing those books, which we're all the lucky recipients of. So I'm just going to say Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, the Mass Cultural Council, Cambridge Community Foundation, and you guys. So if you haven't donated yet, you really should. So you can go to the website, and there's a PayPal account at the website. If you can't afford anything, you can still sign up and get all the information on the website, www.cambridgeforum.org. And there you'll find a lot of podcasts of this program shortly, and many other forums. Also video links to all past programs, and a large collection of digitized classic recordings, because we've been around for a very long time, 57 years now. We do produce a weekly NPR broadcast, and with the help of GBH Forum Network, this video will be uploaded in the next couple of weeks to YouTube, so you can see it again, share it with your friends. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, my wonderful guest speakers. And I wish you all warm greetings and no arguments. And I hope to see you all in 2023, which isn't that far off. Okay, thank you very much.